Indian armed forces hold a major four-day military exercise near the Chinese border, while China boosts its military spending by 11.2%. Can an arms race between India and China be in the best interests of either one? And what are the likely ramifications for the Asia-Pacific region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. On Saturday, India ended a major military exercise in its northeastern sector along the Chinese border. The four-day exercise, codenamed Pralay, or Devastation, tested a wide range of defence capabilities. Almost all major aircraft types operating within the Indian Air Force were involved in the drill, most of which took place in the disputed state of Arunachal Pradesh. The war games coincided with an official visit to India of China's Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi. For years, Sino-Indian bilateral relations have been affected by a dispute over Arunachal Pradesh. The territory is bordered on the north by the Tibet region of China, and while it's been administered by India as a state since 1987, China still claims most of it as a part of the Tibet Autonomous Region. Well, 40% of the world's population lives in India and China, and with expanding economies, the military stakes are high. Both the Chinese and Indian governments have recently increased their defence spending. China says it's to increase its military spending by 11.2% this year to almost $110 billion. It wants to double that amount by 2015. China's official defence budget is the second largest in the world after the United States, but its actual spending, according to foreign experts, may be as much as 50% higher because China doesn't account for its expenditure on nuclear development and other programs such as space. India's military power pales in comparison, yet it too is significantly increasing spending on defence. The 2012 Indian defence budget was set at $36 billion, an 11.6% rise on the previous year, but still less than half of that of China. And globally, India has the 10th largest defence budget on the planet. 51% of India's expenditure is spent on maintaining India's considerable land army of over 1 million men. So, who benefits from an arms race between India and China, and what are the likely ramifications on the Asia-Pacific region? To answer these questions, we're joined by our guests today in New Delhi, Zorowar Daulet Singh. He's a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Alternatives. From Hong Kong, we're joined by Richard Hu. He's an associate professor at the University of Hong Kong. And in Brussels, Jonathan Holslag, who is the author of China plus India, Prospects for Peace. He's also the head of research at the Brussels Institute of Contemporary China Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Jonathan Holslag, we'll start with you. With both China and India spending more on their military capabilities, is greater conflict, perhaps even war between the two, more or less likely in the future?
Well, at this moment, of course, Chinese and Indian leaders go all out to avoid war. They flex their muscle mostly to show to domestic audiences that they will stand strong on key interests, ranging from territorial sovereignty to also, for instance, protecting interests offshore in the Indian Ocean. And there are many other examples. The question remains, though, how much these leaders in Delhi and Beijing are going to continue to keep their heads cool in a climate of growing nationalism and also growing domestic uncertainty. Chinese growth is hitting the curbs, and we also witness in India that the development is in quite some difficulties.
Zorowar Daulet Singh, in terms of its defence budget and future capabilities, to what extent is India now focused less on Pakistan and more on China and the potential threat that China poses to its growing economic power? Do you think that there is the potential for conflict between the two nations at some point in the future?
See, for the last decade, the Indian military modernization is clearly trying to shift away from the Pakistani threat and deal with a far more sophisticated and complex challenge that emanates from China. Regarding your initial your figures that you threw about in terms of the disparity in the military budgets, there's certainly, I think, a recognition now in India that Delhi cannot compete dollar for dollar with a military budget with the Chinese. So instead, the decision or a debate has taken shape where an asymmetric strategy, where India chooses to focus on select hardware and logistical networks on the frontiers to able to at least stake out a robust defensive position on the Sino-Indian border.
Richard Hu, in Hong Kong, China's military spending still pales in comparison to US military spending. Does China see India as a potential military threat? Is it even on its radar?
I think given the current tension between China and India, India is still the secondary concern for Chinese military. And I think the Chinese mainly concern the East China Sea or the East Asian side of security environment. So there's no head-on-head direct arms race between China and India. And China does understand India have a great aspiration to becoming a great power. And but Chinese leaders trying to point at the big picture situation. The two countries should emphasize more on the cooperation side, less on the competition side.
So how important do you think India is right now, Richard Hu, on the global stage? I mean, at least according to China. Does it view India on equal terms? Could it ever view India on equal terms, do you think? Do you think that India will ever become a superpower?
I think there's no doubt India is a rising power like China is. And India need more international platform to demonstrate its capacity in international affairs. So for the Chinese, like BRICS, is one of the good platform for the two countries to both expand their strategic space and to have a bigger role to play in international affairs.
Jonathan Holslag, Chinese leaders like to talk about the country's peaceful rise, but I mean, there's little doubt China has become more belligerent towards its South China Sea neighbours of late over what it sees as its territorial waters. What repercussions does that have for China-India relations?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very important question. China increasingly, however confident it looks from the outside, feels like a trapped giant with its diplomatic maneuverability being squeezed from all sides. The key question is now to which degree China will adjust its posturing and scale back its robust military maneuvering offshore in the South China Sea, also along the border with India. And here the discussions in Beijing are really going into all different directions. On the one hand, you have a strand of diplomats and scholars that believes that Beijing has to try to smoothen relations, eventually make more compromises, concessions, especially with regard to economic cooperation, but also to take a more flexible stance in negotiations on the disputed South China Sea, the border issue with India. But on the other hand, you also have a group of hardliners in Beijing, and this group is getting bigger, especially also backed up by quite hawkish echoes in Chinese news media. And they believe that however China tries to be accepted by its neighbors, however it invests in multilateralism, regional cooperation, that ultimately, if the balance of power shifts into its direction, it will face more resistance, more opposition, and that gradually also a sort of tacit alliance will develop around the US, joined by Japan, obviously, Australia, Vietnam also, and India, which still at this moment is hedging, trying to keep the options open, but has a growing penchant for strategic cooperation with the United States.
Jonathan, the two nations fought a war 50 years ago. Does that conflict have any bearing on the nature of the relationship between India and China today?
absolutely so. It still casts a very, very a gloomy shadow over the relationships. And what it allows from both sides is to have some hawkish nationalist figures in media, in think tanks, but also in Indian Congress and within also the Communist Party of China. And they refer to the 62 incident, to these skirmishes, to justify enhanced military buildups along the border, and also to basically warn governments on both sides that they shouldn't be too easygoing with what the other side is doing, militarily speaking, along the border or on the other side of the border. I think history is one of the main levers that nationalists in China and India have to keep this power play in motion, and especially to pour oil on the flames time and again.
Zorowar Daulet Singh, I don't know whether you want to come back and comment on anything that you've heard there. I also want to get your thoughts on how India views the establishment of Chinese military bases in India's geographic neighbourhood, in Pakistan, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, and its growing influence over countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Maldives.
Let me try and what I'll do is let me try and deconstruct the China threat from sort of an Indian perspective. There's certainly two dimensions to the China challenge India faces. First, there's clearly a territorial threat that's been there since China took over Tibet in 1951. And we saw 1962 as a manifestation or a spillover of that conflict, which directly collided between India and China. The second aspect of the threat is, or rather I would call it a challenge, is, as you mentioned, a regional challenge where the Chinese are clearly cultivating a diverse set of relationships on India's periphery, which in fact overlaps with China's periphery. So you have robust ties with Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan obviously for several decades. So how does India react to this? One way has been Indian diplomacy has actually activated it and created a sort of a nimble foreign policy for its own neighborhood, improved ties with literally every single neighbor of its. Pakistan obviously is a separate challenge which will take a little longer. The second aspect has been to, or at least declaratory, where improved logistical networks on the frontiers engage more directly, also with the Chinese in some ways. If you look at just last week, the Chinese foreign minister was in Delhi, and they've actually signed sort of or given an indication they're going to start a maritime dialogue. So that clearly shows that as so far as the official establishments of both countries are concerned, they are still trying to project a cooperative image insofar as the broader Indian Ocean region is concerned.
Richard,
I would again, I would just emphasize that for India, it's the continental China that is the primary threat and challenge, and rather than the maritime China, which is what a lot of focus naturally emanates from Western analysts and geostrategic experts, because they're more concerned with oceanic sea lanes connecting Western economies with Asia. While for India, that is a secondary priority. It's the continental dimensions of the China challenge that are foremost on Indian strategists' minds.
All right, Richard Hu, please comment on what you've heard there, and tell us what you think, or what you read into the thinking behind the construction by China of military bases in Pakistan, Myanmar, in Sri Lanka. I mean, is China being deliberately provocative here in trying to expand its sphere of influence into India's backyard?
I don't think China trying to be provocative by what you just mentioned. China's relation with Pakistan has been existed for a long time, for several decades, since World War II. And China and Pakistan as a special ally in the South Asian subcontinent. And in Chinese view, this is strategically important for China, but does not want to have an intention to encircling India. This is not the case. And but China does have maritime concern about its oil transportation line, and so that's why China trying to get some seaport access in Pakistan and also in Myanmar to avoid the older transportation go through the Strait of Malacca. So that's why the Indian was a little bit concerned about China is using the maritime bases to encircling India. That's not that's not my reading. And secondly, China does have concern about India still hosting the Tibetan exile government, and that really a big concern for stability in Tibet. And Chinese leaders have to spend a lot of resources to maintain stability and security in Tibet. And if Indian can be a little bit cooperative on that regard, probably Chinese leader will be more appreciated.
Jonathan Holslag, with so many potential areas for conflict, hypothetically, how do you see any potential military clash between the two coming about?
Well, in the short term, it is very unlikely, but you never know, of course, how especially the Indian side is going to handle alleged incursions in, for instance, Arunachal Pradesh, but also elsewhere. If, for instance, the position of the current Congress party is weakened and saber-rattlers in Congress demand the premier to respond very, very forcefully. So I think it boils down to a large degree to the political climate in both capitals, but especially in India, you see that the parliament, Lok Sabha, is proving to be a very volatile environment for premiers and foreign ministers alike to defend a more forthcoming, pragmatic policy. On the Chinese side, I think indeed, as my colleague from Hong Kong said, that the Tibetan issue is going to continue to be a very sensitive one, especially because Beijing anticipates Tibet to slide into a period of protracted instability, also a radicalization of Tibetans, and I believe that this is just going to continue to make it more sensitive to alleged provocations from India, especially Congress Party and the BJP, the main Hinduist party in India, seeming to be supportive to this Tibetan government in exile and giving, as the Chinese again see it, a platform to secessionists. Those two issues, I think, will remain very, very sensitive, very important, and have a potential to escalate.
Okay, Zorowar Daulet Singh, what does India feel the real intention of the continuing growth of China's navy is? Does it feel that it's China's intention to take full control of the shipping lanes of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean? And what does India make of China's territorial claims that Richard Hu was talking about over the islands in
right.
that sea?
Right. Let me try and just give you a sense of the question that you asked just previously to Jonathan, that what is the type of shape that conflict that we could see militarily between India and China. I think the age of sort of an attritional, large-scale conflict being fought over several months is, I think, over. We're living in an age where, given there is already a nuclearized dimension to the conflict, and you have a fairly sophisticated conventional setting, so you're going to see, if at all, it's going to be a limited sort of a coercive type of strategies being employed by the Chinese to sort of concentrate forces on a particular point on the India-China border, to not so much to grab territory as much, but to perhaps signal or make a point that, like, which they actually did in 1962, which was to launch a punitive strike against India because India was seen to be sort of a barrier to China's hold over Tibet, etc., etc. So coming to your question on the maritime part, I would again reiterate what I just mentioned, that it's not so clear-cut that Chinese naval expansion in the Western Pacific in the foreseeable future, in the near term, let's say 5 to 10 years, has a direct impact on Indian security. As long as the Chinese are able to be a little more transparent, engage in multilateral and bilateral dialogues, and reassurance and confidence building measures in terms of what their intentions are. Like, I'll give you an example of my conversation with the Chinese. They have clearly openly recognized that insofar as the Indian Ocean region is concerned, which is sort of the far seas for them, they are simply not in a position and will not be in a position for the next 2 decades to impose any sort of dominating strategic position in those waters. So the corollary of that is that they have no choice, if they're going to protect their sea lanes, the energy sea lanes from the Middle East, to forge some sort of a cooperative relationship with India in the northern Indian Ocean.
Okay.
And I think the maritime dialogue that's just been announced last week is an expression of perhaps a Chinese position on that issue.
All right, Richard Hu, if China is, as its leaders often say, a peaceful nation, why does it need to increase its military spending as it has done, as it is doing, and why does it need to grow its navy in particular?
I think there are several reasons. First, you see the military budgets increasing since late 1990s. I see this as mainly the makeup increase because in the 1980s and early part of 1990s, Chinese military was under budget, and they sacrificed a lot about their armament and modernization of weapons. So since late 1990s, you see the big increase every year, steady growth every year. So this is make up for personnel costs and for others modernization weapon programs. So this trend I see will continue for maybe for quite some time. And secondly, China have the needs to secure secure its maritime transportation and also have cover a larger scope of defense. So the needs is increasing, so that requires Chinese military to put up more capacity to fulfill the requirement. And the other thing is, Chinese major defense direction is on the east side, East Asia. And also now you can see there's a lot of problem with other neighbors in East Asia, and also U.S. Pivotal back to Asia, and that's caused a lot of concerns. So I don't think the military spending will be cut back in a few years, and instead it will increase continually. So this is basically the reason, the major driver. Okay. The other major driver in the last few years was the Taiwan Strait crisis. And now with that tension dampened, and the Chinese military probably looking for more maritime capability or long-range power projections.
Okay. All right. Jonathan Holslag, I mean, the issue of Taiwan has just been raised here. I want to know where you think the US comes into all of this. Does the US have the political will and the ability, both diplomatically and militarily, to keep relations between China and its neighbours, in particular India, peaceful? Does China yet have the military might to challenge the US?
Well, I think that the United States' presence in Eastern Asia is absolutely the #1 factor that drives China's military spending and modernization at the moment. And here you see two powers locked in a very traditional security dilemma over the Pacific. However, the United States tries to keep its defense perimeter close to the Asian continent with a series of bases ranging from South Korea all the way to Australia, and also massive naval presence. If we only think of the 7th Fleet that is roaming in the waters of the Pacific. The Chinese have an incentive to break through that security perimeter, because they believe that as long as the Americans have the upper hand in this vicinity, that China will never be able to determine the outcome of eventual conflicts over the South and East China Seas, which are certainly boiling up at the moment. But even Taiwan, the Chinese are still not entirely sure that the current rapprochement towards Taipei is going to work in the end, because you have different variables, Taiwanese public opinion, for instance, that are not developing in such a positive direction. So that the Chinese military still takes an armed contingency with Taiwan quite seriously. So, but ultimately we have here a security dilemma between China and the United States, and as the US feels the balance of power to shift towards China, it is lifting up its military presence. And I think then ultimately the Chinese will continue to respond, and with, as a result, of course, that neighboring countries like India, but also Japan, feel more threatened. Yeah. That's the game, and I think this is the dynamic that will continue to cause stability in the region.
Gentlemen, that is where we'll have to leave it, I'm afraid, for today. Very much, thanks very much indeed for being with us. Our guests today in Delhi, Zorowar Daulet Singh; in Hong Kong, Richard Hu; and in Brussels, Jonathan Holslag. And thank you very much indeed for being with us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, if you want to send us any feedback, email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. From me, Adrian Finnegan, I'll see you again. Bye for now.